society. So I begin with some remarks to my research approach and my field research. Then I will explain some basics on nonviolent action and civil disobedience. Afterwards, I will turn to Marcuse's notion of ecology, the active role of the senses, and his concept of radical sensibility and the aesthetic needs. Finally, I want to showcase some examples of two sensibilities at work on the streets. With this background, I hope to gain more understanding about the specific situation of climate activism. I'm a researcher committed to cultural studies as a critical theory. And what I'm interested in is how people get empowered and disempowered by specific structures and forces in their everyday lives. We are analyzing the contexts to gain more knowledge about the constructions of people's lived realities and the power relations in which they are entangled. So my aim is to understand what is going on around the on the streets during protests advocating climate action. So how can we understand the outrage, the violent expressions, the cruel fantasies which are expressed in social media postings, for example? What can we learn about how people understand themselves and their position in society? And what knowledge helps people to better understand their contexts and what can enable them to change it and the relations of power? I understand my research as thoroughly political, and therefore I practice engaged ethnography. My data are obtained from participatory observations, narrative interviews with activists, and extant visual and narrative discourse material as social media posts, newspaper articles, and commentaries. For today, one specific social media post is relevant. In a street blockade in August 2023, a car driver verbally attacked an activist. He shouted at her, "Do you really think this is effective?" And she replied, "What else should we do? What do you think is more effective?" And to be honest, well, he hadn't had an answer. But the video got more than 1,000 replies, and there are still replies coming in. So I consider that a really rich source to understand what actually happens in this situation. And we will return to the post later. At the beginning of my research are social eco movements which advocate effective climate actions to prevent the exceeding of the tipping points in the climate system. So this exceeding will likely cause unforeseen and unstoppable reactions within the climate systems. And to raise awareness for the urgency to act against the climate catastrophe and to unveil the greenwashing of corporations and governments, social eco movements use tactics of non-violent action. It is understood that violence is not the only means of effective intervention in conflicting situations. Therefore, non-violent actions have a specific view on political power. They believe that the exercise of power is dependent from the lived consent of the ruled. This consent can be withdrawn, and through this the power of the opponent can be controlled and even destroyed. Thus, non-violent action has a specific concept of the nature of political power. Governments are dependent on the people who are deliberately cooperating, and power is seen as pluralistic and not in the hands of a single person or group. Another very common view of political power can be termed monolithic. Here, the assumptions of political power are that people are dependent upon those who are in power positions, that power is self-perpetuating and cannot easily be controlled nor destroyed. As political power is understood as durable, the acknowledged means to change the monolithic ownership of power are elections. Alternatives to change power relations in the monolithic view are then already coups or destructive violence. Other types of pressure or control of political power are not accepted within this view. So the pluralistic view of political power instead relies on non-violent actions to build up pressure and control from the roots of power, the society itself. Non-violent action includes different tactics, and those applied by climate activists in the last couple of years were symbolic acts like dyeing fountains or rivers, symbolic soiling of artwork, luxury stores and hotels, banner drops as means of communication with a wider audience, protest blockings of street, airports, highways, and civil disobedience of neutral laws. The latter involves unannounced assemblies, blocking of streets, and gluing to the pavements. The street blockades are in fact assemblies, and the right to assembly is protected by constitutional law. In Austria, activists thus face minor penalties for breaking administrative law. In Germany, instead, the non-violent blocking of traffic is deemed as a violent act when other means than the own body is used. And cars in the first row are understood as means to block the street. So non-violent blockings are in Germany treated as coercion. The aim of these movements is to force governments to change the behavior towards the climate crisis and stop doing business as usual. And opponents of the protests react to them in different ways. The activists' actions provoke aggressive response by the opponents of the protests. They appear as seemingly reliable comments in newspapers, verbal attacks in comments on social media, and as assaults during protests on the streets. The controversies over the legitimacy of protest techniques can be traced down to the two conflicting views of political power. Those who see the actions of climate change movements as an outrageous attack and interpret it as violent actions against the owners of power can be read as advocates of political power of the few. Conservative journalists, newspaper commentaries, and politicians are framing the protests as radical. Oops. Okay, no, it works. As radical. They are posing questions of adequacy, linking non-violent action to violence. Demands of stiffer penalties and the legitimacy of vigilantism of car drivers against protesters are represented as simple questions of opinion, not as restrictions of civil rights. By playing with the connotations of radical, imaginations of riots, crime, threats to democracy, and even terrorism are provoked. So the demands of climate activism are literally radical because they are going to the roots of how we understand ourselves in society and our relationships. Most of what our society understands as success is put in question, and business as usual is not an option anymore. Speech acts are not simply symbolical. Discourses have material effects, and several regulations have already been enacted. Higher penalties, for example, for climate activists in one Austrian province, preventive arrest in Germany, or Sekundenklebertransportverbot, another very nice German word, which means the prohibition to carry superglue for climate activists. Okay. So the analysis of the commentaries on Facebook showed that people draw back to these arguments against climate protesters. People interpret the power relations in a monolithic view and see themselves as powerless muppets dependent on the goodwill of the government. Others deem activists as criminals and terrorists and demand imprisonment or even psychiatric treatments. Other commentators relate to democratic rights and advise them to find a political party and participate in elections to find a majority for their concerns. So the struggle against climate change is not one about solely legitimate practices, but it is also articulated with practical understandings of the operation of political power. So, to explain what can be witnessed in this situation, I want to draw on Marcuse's notion of ecology, his understanding of the human-nature relation, the role of the senses in reproducing the status quo, and how a radical sensibility contributes to the liberation of mankind from capitalism. For Marcuse, ecology is one of the central forces to a fight against the old world. So, this old world is characterized by exploitation of human and non-human nature, aggressiveness, toil, inequality, poverty, and destruction. It is this specific modern understanding of human relation to nature and the environment which in return reveals the attitude towards humanity too. Here, the control, exploitation, and subordination of nature serves too as a vehicle of control, exploitation, and subordination of people. Nature is understood as a historical entity already transformed by society. This means acknowledging that nature is subjected to a specific rationality. And this is a technological, instrumentalist rationality bent to the requirements of capitalism. Marcuse's analysis of the late capitalist post-Fordist societies led to the description of one-dimensionality of man and instrumental rationalities. Here, the proletariat, former seen as revolutionary subject, emerged to be a carrier of the system, as Rainer Winter writes. Therefore, Marcuse turned to the new social movements, which appeared in the 60s and 70s, to describe how a free society could be attained. The logic and rationalities of late capitalism, in which every single object in the world, as well as human and human nature relationships, are subjugated to, are baked into the perception and experience of every member of society. This reaches down to the very level of instinct and physiology and affects the imagination of what kind of society is even possible. Marcuse points out that the reproduction of our existing society takes not only place in the mind, but also through the senses. What is needed is an unlearning of the senses to perceive the world out there differently and independent from alienated labor as basic organizing principle of our experience. People have introjected the values and logic of capitalism, and these are mirrored by their distorted needs. People themselves have become mere tools of labor and instruments of the violent destruction of nature in the name of productive exploitation, as Douglas Kellner summarizes. Resistance and revolution, too, have the capacity to transform experience. Marcuse therefore introduces the concept of radical sensibility to describe the practical role of the senses. Seeing, hearing, smelling, touching, tasting have an active role in shaping reason and understanding of the world. Therefore, they have a vital position in making liberation possible. The senses are not simply receiving a given reality, but have the potential to discover different qualities within every object. The emancipated senses can repel the instrumentalist rationality of capitalism, writes Marcuse. Here, not an instrumentalist rationality is the guiding principle, but the aesthetic sense needs. To achieve the goal of a society liberated from aggression, competition, and destruction, freedom must be a sensus need, an object life of the life instincts, as Marcuse writes. For this, a second alienation is necessary, that from alienated society, writes Marcuse. With that in mind, I now want to return to climate activism. All social eco-movements which were found in the last years call for immediate action against global warming and for effective climate measurements, ending fossil fuel dependency, lowering carbon dioxide emissions, implementing citizens' council for climate policies, and so on. It is not only ecological transformation, but an overall change which is needed. To resolve the climate crisis, reorganization of our economy, agriculture, transport, and labor is necessary. So the movements are not single-issue organizations or movements. Justice is at the core of their mission, and all demand climate justice for most affected people and areas. And climate justice implies taking responsibility of those who profit most from the pollution and are less vulnerable to the effects of climate change. So social eco-movements can be seen as having developed this radical sensibility and demanding radical change, therefore. The A 2022 network released their declaration on the crisis and described the basic values of their action. It states that the old world, it states that the, sorry, let's go back one. It states that the old world we are living in cannot be sustained, and they are creating a new world based on the aesthetic needs of love, forgiveness, and solidarity. Already here in the first sentences, I'm reminded of what Marcuse described as new sensibility, the essence of the life instincts over aggressiveness and guilt. With life instincts, the eros, as driving force, priorities are radically reorganized. The declaration continues with a conception of humanity based on love and truth and turns its back on evil and death. There's a specific social content of political action towards a liberated society. The needs articulated here stand for nothing less than the pure survival of mankind. The aesthetic needs relate to the life-enhancing forces, and there is an imagination of a better world without aggression. They strive to prevent further extinction, and they will make action for change. So let's now turn to the streets again, where activists are struggling for social change. When we approach the protest practices and reactions to the street protests and blockages of the letzte Generation from this perspective, we can see how two distinct sensibilities are at work. The radical sensibility in practice and the instrumental rationality of capitalism inscribed into the perceptions and expressed in the tangible experiences of the people. So from this viewpoint, the outrage which is directed against protesters on the streets can be seen as actions to keep the status quo upright, to fight for the moral integrity which is strongly challenged and provoked by the protesters and the disturbing of the daily life. And we can observe this protecting of the status quo on different levels, on the institutional and from below, from the people. So cases of disproportionate police violence were reported during blockades and police detention centers. Pain-inflicting techniques to remove activists from the street were threatened to them and even used. So activists, in Austria, activists were forced to disrobe and expose their genitals for inspection in police detention centers. This leads Amnesty International just recently to denounce violation against freedom of assembly and freedom of speech in Germany. So what kind of reactions can we see on the what kind of reaction can we see on the activists' question, what else should they do instead of street blockades? In the replies, we can observe the reconstruction of normality through evoking the activists as antagonists. Normality is described as going to work, being conform, not disturbing the daily routine. The activists are seen as deviant who disturb the normal citizen. The motivation of the activists simply cannot be sensed, nor does it relate to the experience of the normal citizens. The activists are called stupid, weird criminals, and were accused as terrorists. They are constructed as the opposite of the norm, the outcasted. They are humiliated and dehumanized. What is deviant must be kept imprisoned, made invisible to allow for the purity of the society. The working people are subsumed under the term citizen and population. Here we can see how the activity of labor is connected to what makes someone a valuable and full member of society. To count as reliable and reputable citizen, you must work and pay taxes. Political activism is not seen as a kind of work. Activists are deemed aversive to work and scrounger. The opposite of them is the hard-working people. It is understood that working is no pleasure, or labor is no pleasure. People should not further be fraught with inconveniences. There is an understanding of toil, but it seems inevitable. The rigor is directed towards the activists. There seems no alternative to labor and subordinating to the requirements of a society shaped by capitalism. Well, last sentences. And here too, Marcuse's concept of the instrumentalist reason can be applied to understand and reconstruct the context. There is no other reality possible. Even the imagination of an alternative to alienated labor, toil and aggression is treated as a violation of social morality. Radical sensibility instead allows for an imagination of a world beyond repression, exploitation and aggression, and to unveil the limitations of an instrumentalist rationality. What I try to show is how intellectual concepts can help to understand how people's everyday lives are structured and organized by specific forces. To apply Marcuse's notion of instrumentalist reason and radical sensibility helps to grasp why people can be empowered by power relations which promote actual subjugation. So two preconditions collide on the streets which promote very different experience and understanding of these events. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much for this wonderful lecture about the activism in not only in Austria, it's also here in Germany. I have a question, which, sorry for that, because that that bothered me every time.
Yeah.
So, what is the difference between emancipatory violence and non-emancipatory violence? What do you have in mind? What do you how you have to explain to society my violent acts, my activism is maybe ethical or political better and will open opinions, options for a lot of people and not close options for other people. And it has an ethical normative standard, which is more than closer to emancipatory than to regressive violence.
First of all, what activists like Letzte Generation do is nonviolent action. It's not violence. So violence is using weapons and destruct people and kill. So there's a clear distinction what is understood as violent and non-violent. And we can, of course, and what I try to show is how these non-violent actions are represented as violence, which they are not.
The point, my question is, so if people have other goals for their protest and they do the same things, how will you judge it? What does it mean? If, for example, the right wings go on the street, do the same things than the last generation right now. That is always bothering me.
From my personal opinion, from my personal opinion, it's always who does profit from the goals? Is it humanity? Is it a society? Is it everybody, or is it just a single group? So who is profiting? That's my personal opinion. How I distinct between what is emancipatory and what is not.
Okay, that was my first statement. For me, it's you have to have it's you must open options for a lot of people and not close options for activism or something like that. And that is my measure. We'll just see, is it help it to open options for a lot of people to get a better life in the society, to save nature, to reform the system or do a revolution? So you have to, that is my measure. Open options for people and not close. If the right wings, for example, they want to close options, for other people. And the first generation, I think they will open options for other people, living, bad nature, and so on. And because we have, if you're an activist and you do violent acts, I not agree totally with your definition for non-violence and violence. But we want to, we do violent acts. Then we have to reflect on it. What is the reason for this violent act? Is it just a reaction of the police, of the state? Or is in the action violence involved in my action? Do I plan eventually violence?
I don't understand.
You don't understand?
No,
I'm sorry.
Just to
is it
maybe someone can translate or relate.
Okay.
Statement.
Okay. Okay, we can discuss it later.
Yes,
okay,
great,
thanks.
Great. I love you.
Is there a question from the audience? I'm sorry, but this that's a problem. What bothers me, and you picked on exact my point. You picked it, and a lot of people know that I'm working on this. Okay, is there another statement, a question on the audience? Yes.
Thank you for your talk. Just a simple question, because you just referred to the negative reactions in these social media feeds. How many positive feedback is there given in these social media feeds? Is there any, or?
Yeah, there are some, but well, advocating pro activism or just commenting on a video or in social media for pro causes that you are dehumiliated and shouted at. And so I think most of the people just don't write anything because they don't want to be targeted as the opponent shouted dump or sick or whatever. So there are some, and even the Letzte Generation, they reply on some of the comments. Yeah, but we all know really dialogue is not possible in social media posts. So unfortunately, yeah, but for me, it's a rich resource just to understand. Yeah, what is
short. Just kidding. Thanks. I think thanks for an excellent paper. It was very interesting the way you weave all of these things together in terms of the empirical research and the interviews, and then bringing Marcuse into the frame in terms of more radical transformation. My question, though, based on your conversation briefly with Peter Irwin at the front, I'd frame it slightly differently in light of some of the issues you just mentioned, for example, on social media, doxing and harassment and bullying, et cetera. We've seen, for example, a number of women politicians leave politics recently because the harassment and the death threats are just too much, and women of color particularly. But my question is, I guess, somewhat different, and that is, given what you just mentioned about this kind of social media bullying and harassment, what is the status, or what is the response of, what's the response to that? And is nonviolence enough? I don't know if that leads in the direction of Peter Irwin's question, namely to respond to violence with violence. I don't think that's where you're going. That's not what you're saying. You're talking about nonviolent action. I appreciate that. But what is the response of activists, climate activists, or any other activists to this kind of unapologetic harassment, bullying, and whatnot?
Well, they are not naive, you know. They expect that. They expect the violence from police. They know that they will get hurt within the actions, and they expecting this response. And on the one hand, is that, well, it's still it's attention. So it gives attention. Not only, of course, there's always discuss the action. So is this legitimate to block the streets? But you cannot not talk about climate change anymore, of course. And so the topic, the thing which it is really about, is talked about. So in this sense, they reach their goals. That climate change is a topic, is an issue heavily discussed. So yeah, that's what it is, and the rest, they just expect it. They know that that will come. They have learned from civil rights movements. They have learned from the women's liberation movement. So they don't see them excluded from the history. So they know there's a history of these actions, and that's where they got their power from, and the energy to just go on.